As we continue to cycle through this time of year, it can be more and more difficult to remember in the glare of all the pretty lights what the real blessing is. For many, this is the most difficult time of year. It may be powerful reminders of who's missing or what's missing. It's a time that can bring a spotlight or turn up the heat in any issues that we might have in relationships or shortcomings we might have in our life or tensions we might even have in our family. Nothing like having all the family together for a day or two. And then any of those kinds of things can begin to surface. So we can sing peace and joy on earth, but sometimes this is the very time of year that spotlights what's missing in our lives. Before we go any further, we completed, as you remember, a few weeks ago, a Hurts, Habits, and Hang-Ups study for about 8 weeks. And I want to tell you that if you want to pursue that further, if you want to continue in that, the second Tuesday in January, we'll start in the Tweener Room, a Hurts, Habits, and Hang-Ups Bible study. You're welcome to attend, or if you know someone that would love to be a part of that, just an authentic, genuine, open Bible study where real life intersects real Bible study. But this morning, I want to talk to you about drama. Drama in relationships can create emotional fatigue. It can even bring about a deep, bone-deep spiritual weariness. In Genesis chapter 28, Jacob struggles with weariness. Now, if you sort of review where he's at, in chapter 27 is coming to a conclusion. This is where Jacob's mother talks him into lying to his dad. It's where he pretends to be his older brother, and he cooks something for his dad, and he puts skins on his arms so that when his dad, who's nearly blind, feels his arms covered in sheepskin, Jacob feels and smells like his brother. Now, to me, that says a lot. But the dad finds out he's been lied to. Esau comes in and begs for a blessing and gets something less. Esau holds a grudge against Jacob. Can you imagine such family drama? Was anybody here the favorite child in their family besides me? Anybody? One of the things that's interesting among my own siblings, and we see it in our children, is the concern over who's the favorite child and who's the least favorite child. Because we lived so far away for so many years, when we lived in California, every time I would come in for Christmas to Texas, it would be a big deal to my parents and especially to my mom because her boy was home. I'm the only boy, the only heir and prince of the throne. Can you imagine that? And throughout the years, there'd be different medical crises my mom went through with open heart surgeries and cancer surgeries and things like that. And I would rush in from California to be there. And my mother introduced to the nurses her 3 children, her eldest daughter, her middle son, and her youngest daughter. And she said in kind of a groggy post-operative state, she said as the 3 of us were standing there as loving and doting children, she said, "This one is my oldest daughter and my son," and she smiled. And she pointed to my youngest sister and said, "And that one." Mostly because my little sister has always lived nearby and has faithfully taken them to their doctor's appointments and cared for them. And I just roll in on the holidays. And so my sisters developed a nickname for me. I'm called the White Horse. Because when the sun's in town, everybody brightens up. And they were just like, every time I'd show up. So whenever for Christmas my parents a few years ago got Wi-Fi in their home, I set it up. Guess what the password is? My sisters had to type in White Horse every time they wanted to use my parents' internet. But my oldest sister moved to Oklahoma City. Her husband is a teacher at Oklahoma Christian, or in Edmond, I guess. And they're in a community right across the street, and there's an electronic gate. And my little sister drove up to visit her older sister, and she called and she said, "So what's the gate code to get in?" My older sister said, "You're never going to believe it." What? It's White Horse's birthday. When you're special, you're special. What can I say? Jacob and Esau grew up in a home where the father loved one son more than the other, and the mother loved the other son more than the other. Now, can you imagine the real tensions? Well, it's so bad that when Esau has his blessing taken from him, he begins to contemplate murder. That's pretty serious sibling rivalry. It's so bad that by the time we get to chapter 28, Isaac calls Jacob in, gives him the blessing, and says that God is going to give you, may He give you the land of your sojourning. And he said, I want you to go back to where our family's from to pick a wife. I don't want you marrying one of the Canaanite women here locally. And so that brings us in this chapter. Jacob is traveling. He's got a brother that's really mad at him. He's got a father that he's lied to. He's got a mother who sent him away for his own protection. And he's supposed to get a wife. Now, why would you be nervous to find a good woman, right? So think about all the stuff that's going on in Jacob's life. He's coming out of a fractured or dysfunctional or troubled family. And he's supposed to choose someone. This will be the second biggest decision in his life. Who he'll be married to, who he will spend his life with. And in that travel, the sun sets, and he grows tired. So in verse 10, in verse 11, he came to a certain place, and he spent the night there because the sun had set. He took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head, and he lay down in that place. Now, depending on what research you do, there is a friendly argument about how significant the stone is. Because when I read this, I think, wow, that is terrible. Man, it must be really rough to have to sleep out on the open ground, and the best you can do for a pillow is a rock. However, in some cultures, this is not all that unusual. My understanding is, in some Asian cultures, we would almost call it a wooden stone, a wooden stool, is used to prop up the head to sleep at night. Now, I'd wake up pretty grumpy if I was sleeping on a rock for a pillow. But what's interesting is either way, whether this is normal or abnormal, it is an expression and a tool of comfort. Either that's the best he could do, or that's normally what he does. Either way, he pulls a stone out to support himself to sleep. He has a dream in verse 12, a dream where there's a ladder that's set on the earth, and it reaches all the way to heaven. And on this ladder, the angels of God are ascending and descending on this ladder. Now, what makes this picture that he's seeing so powerful is the careful order of the angels' movements. Because the ladder starts on the earth, goes to heaven, and what Jacob sees, angels go up the ladder and come down. Not come down and go up, which is what I would have expected, because aren't angels from heaven? So it's fascinating that in this vision, the angels start from the bottom of the ladder, the earth, go up and come back down, which means the source or where the angels are coming from or their starting place is the bottom of the ladder. I would have thought it would have been the top of the ladder. But he sees it as the bottom. And this makes a big impression on him. We'll keep reading. Verse 13. And behold, the Lord, depending on your translation, this is the word. It's either in all capital letters or you might have Jehovah or Yahweh. This is the big name for God. It's the one that originates in Exodus 3 when the voice speaks to Moses in the burning bush and Moses says, who am I supposed to say has sent me? What is your name? And God says, I am the I am. And it's such a struggle in Hebrew to express that most of our English translations just give us a hint. They give us the English word Lord or Jehovah or Yahweh, and they capitalize it or italicize it so they say, this is the word we're talking about. It's the big name, the I am, the eternal God. So the Lord stood above it, this above the earth, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the land on which you lie. I will give it to you and to your descendants. And he goes on to talk about his descendants will be like the dust of the earth. Remember, his father said, may the Lord give you the land through which you sojourn. And now God says, and I'm going to give it to you. Confirming that his father said. But he also said in verse 15, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go. Jacob will spend his life wandering. Now, most of us like to vacation. Some of us like to camp. Some of us like to go to unusual settings and see things. But most of us also will say there's no place like home. Jacob will spend his life, like his father and his grandfather before him, wandering. So what God says is, wherever you go, this life of wandering, wherever you go, I will be with you. God will be his source of home, his source of connection. I will be with you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I've done what I have promised you. Now, would you notice what Jacob does when he wakes up? The next verse tells us in verse 16, when he awoke from his sleep, he said, surely the Lord, there's that big word again, surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. Now, why would he say that way? The Lord is in this place. Because that's where the ladder was anchored, and that's where the angels were coming up from and going back to. The source of the angels' movements was not in heaven, which I would have expected, but upon the earth where the ladder was anchored. That's the place where the Lord stood, this bottom of the ladder, this place above the earth. Jacob gets that because he says this, surely the Lord is in this place, I didn't know it, verse 17. He was afraid and he said, how awesome is this place? So what's he associating? Well, the place where he pillowed his head with a stone becomes sacred ground, much like the burning bush where Moses went and God said, take off your sandals. How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, the place where God dwells. And this is the gate of heaven. God's presence was seen by Jacob to be in that spot. He will name it Bethel, for the house of God. And because it's the place where a ladder connects earth and heaven, he says this is the gateway, this is the entrance, this is how you get from earth to heaven. And of course, it's not a literal ladder that you can climb, for in the second part of the vision, when the Lord speaks, the Lord himself is the ladder. He's the one standing between heaven and earth. He is the place where the angels find their beginning. Does that make sense so far? Shake your head this way or this way. Okay. Now let's go to John chapter 9. John chapter 9. Jacob is going to take this stone, he's going to pour oil on it, he's going to erect it as a monument or as a reminder of God's presence, and he will call it Bethel, and there'll be two things he'll be stressing. This is the house of God, where God dwells, and this is the gateway or the entrance or the connection to heaven. All right? So in John chapter 9, Jesus says something, well, it causes him a lot of trouble. Gets people upset with him. In John chapter 9, he's been talking about Abraham. I'm sorry, we need to be in John chapter 8. It's the last part of the chapter. John chapter 8. He starts talking about Abraham and his relationship with Abraham, and they misunderstand what he's trying to say. In fact, in verse 53, here's what the crowd says to him. They say, surely you're not greater than our father Abraham who died. The prophets died too. Whom do you make yourself out to be? Who are you claiming to be? This is an excellent question. Jesus goes on to say, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. But look at verse 56. Here's what Jesus says. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. Now they're confused, and you could imagine why. Because the way Jesus is talking is that Abraham has known him. But there's about 2,000 years between when Abraham lived and died and Jesus standing there talking. And Jesus doesn't appear to be more than 2,000 years old. And that's why they say in verse 57, the Jews said to him, "You're not yet 50 years old and you've seen Abraham? Are you just crazy?" Because as Jesus is talking, he's saying, Abraham was delighted to spend time with me. And they're like, what are you talking about? That'd be like somebody today saying, oh yeah, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and I, we were good buddies growing up. And you look at them like, what, are you that old? That can't be possible. And it's not, except if you go back to, who do you make yourself out to be? Right? So when they say this, how you're not even 50 years old. How can he's about 31 or 2 at this point. How can you be saying you and Abraham have been together? Verse 58. Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born," the way this translation says it, "I am." Now that's terrible English. Sometimes translations try to work with it because that's not a good way to speak in English with verb tense agreement. Before Abraham was born, I am. What Jesus is doing is using a particular word. So the literal translations will give you bad English to give you what he just said. The reason that Jesus and Abraham have spent time together, because Jesus is the I am of the Old Testament. He's the voice that was speaking in the burning bush. They understood what he said, bad English or not, because in verse 59, therefore they picked up stones to throw at him. You stone someone when they express blasphemy. Who do you make yourself out to be? Jesus makes the boldest, most amazing claim of all time. He says, I am the I am. He'll do that about 7 times in the book of John. When they'll go to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he'll say, who are you looking for? And they'll say, Jesus of Nazareth. He will say in the literal translation, I am. He doesn't say, it's me. He says, I am. You know that because the whole crowd collapses. They fall. Why would they fall if he just says, yeah, that's me? Because he claims to be the I am, the eternal, present, promise-keeping God. It's huge. It's the biggest word in the Bible. In Jacob's story in Genesis 28, it was the Lord in all capital letters, or Yahweh, or Jehovah, the I am. Jesus says, that's me. Well, how about we flip over to chapter 1 of the book of John, verse 51. John chapter 1. One of the struggles that I have is sarcasm. Unfortunately, I think I'm pretty good at it. I've spent years honing my ability. But sarcasm or snarkiness or negativity, those are not gifts of the Spirit, are they? In fact, sarcasm has been described as anger turned sideways. In other words, if you just say something ugly, you'll probably get in trouble. So you say something cute or something funny. I'm just joking. When really where that originates or comes from is not a positive place. And so when I'm tempted to spend my day in sarcastic thoughts or snarky comments, that's not coming from a heart that's filled with joy. Right? It's not coming from a depth of internal peace in my relationship with myself and with God, which says something to me. There's a powerful self-diagnostic right there. Where are those things coming from? Jesus will say that the mouth speaks out of the fullness of the heart. So where's that coming from? Well, if we tend to have a critical or negative view of people or of life, guess what comes out? John chapter 1, verse 43. Verse 43, pardon me, John 1, verse 43. The next day, Jesus purposed to go into Galilee, and he found Philip. And Jesus said, follow me. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, of the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael, and he said, we found him, of whom Moses and the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. We have found what we've all been waiting for centuries. Isn't that the best news ever? Yes. Well, how does Nathanael respond? This sounds familiar to me. Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Well, thanks a lot. Mr. Gloom and Doom. Here's the guy with a rain cloud that just follows him, stays over his head all the time. Because here somebody said, we found him. And his first response is, nothing good can come from Nazareth. That's the way kind of they would talk. That's kind of where that comes from, a similar sort of joke, if you will. But it's something snarky, something sarcastic, something edgy. Why? Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him, and he said, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. Nathanael said, how do you know me? Jesus answered and said, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. I know who you are, Nathanael. And I suspect if you saw him sitting under the fig tree, you probably heard him when he responded to Philip, don't you think? Nathanael said, Rabbi, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. And then listen to this answer. Jesus answered and said, because I said to you that I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You'll see greater things than these. And he said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now, where have we heard that before? The only other place I know of that you're going to see angels ascending and descending is in Jacob's vision in Genesis 28. A vision where he saw a ladder that connected earth and heaven. A ladder is a way to get from one place to another. A connection, a bridge. What Jacob said was, I didn't know God was in this place, and he called it Bethel as the house of God, the place where God dwells. Jesus will describe himself as the temple of God. In fact, when they're viewing the temple that's supposed to house the very presence of God, where they come and worship and offer sacrifice and interact, he says, you see this temple, it'll be torn down, but it'll be rebuilt in 3 days. And he was talking about his death, burial, and resurrection. Jesus is God. He said, I am the I am. Well, Jacob in Genesis 28 said, I saw the I am standing over this place. The second thing that Jacob said is, this is Bethel. This is the house of God. This is where God dwells. The second thing he said is, this is the gateway to heaven. Jesus is the gateway to heaven. He said, I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. In fact, he says that no one can come to the Father except he come through me. He's the gateway. He's the ladder. He's the connection, the bridge between heaven and earth. The very presence of God, the source of angels. Because angels don't descend on the Son of Man and ascend, which is what I would expect it. They ascend from him to heaven and come back. Jesus is the very presence of God, the place where we dwell with him. Now flip over to the book of Matthew, if you would, chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11. Jacob had this experience with God because he was tired, because he had a stone for a pillow, that he came from such tremendous family drama and tension and struggle and dysfunction, and he's in the midst of family discovery. He's supposed to come out of that environment and find some woman to marry and live with happily ever after. In the middle of that swirling chaos of relationships, he finds himself in the very house of God. In Matthew chapter 11, he has been sharing with his disciples the struggles they'll go through. And then he says in verse 28, he says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. You might be so weary or maybe so accustomed that a stone offers you support and comfort. That the place where you sleep is outdoors. There's no family around. You're completely by yourself. But we're not. Because what the Lord said to Jacob, I'm always with you. Jacob didn't realize that he was taking a night's rest in God's house. He just assumed it was a desolate place. But it wasn't. Because the Lord was always with him. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. But remember that rest is not always inactivity. Does anybody go on vacation and then have to come back and go to work so you can get caught up on your rest? Does anybody vacation like that? If you're not completely exhausted at the end of your vacation, it wasn't much of a vacation, right? Now, there's some of you that are very deep and intellectual and profound and etc. that you take a vacation and you read great books and you write great works and you think deep thoughts. That's not what I do. At any given time, to tell you the truth. But most of us go vacation, and you could argue that we're more active on vacation than we are at work. But the reason why it's rest is because it's an activity that is refreshing rather than burdensome. So when Jesus says, I'll give you rest, He's not saying, so just be done with anything. It's about how about doing something that is refreshing, something that is fulfilling. It may be hard. It may be challenging. It might even be scary, but it'll be good for you. Because by contrast, we may not be working as hard at life, but if it's mundane, if it's a rat race, if it's going in a circle, if it's meaningless, folks, that is exhausting to the soul. The why am I doing this? Why does this matter? This is a waste of my life. That is exhausting. The kind of exhaustion you don't get 8 hours of sleep and get over. But a soul-numbing, spirit-wearying aimlessness. Jesus says, if you're weary and heavy laden, come to me and I will give you rest. That's why He says, take my yoke upon you. It's a harness. That means activity. That means I'm going to be doing something, yes. But something meaningful. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. They're both still there, a yoke and a burden. But finally, it's something that is meaningful. Something that at the end of the day and at the end of life we can say, that was worth doing. What could that be? Well, flip back a couple of chapters. In chapter 9, and let me give you one more diagnostic. I've already given you the idea of negativity, of snarkiness or sarcasm or being critical. But our reaction to need can be a diagnostic of how we're doing. In a simple example, have you ever had a long day at work and you come home and you're feeling exhausted, you're feeling weary, and you get home and either the spouse or the children or the dishwasher needs something? It's blown a hose or they've thrown a fit or they've got one more question and you go, oh, can I get 5 minutes of peace? We do that if we're coming from an exhausted state, right? We're like, one more thing. Really? Can I just get a minute? So our reaction is a diagnostic or is a signal about where we are. Whether we're experiencing joy and peace and contentment or whether we're running on spiritual fumes. Jesus, in verse 35, has had a long stretch of service. Verse 35 says, Jesus was going through all the cities and the villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. Don't read that too fast. Tim, are you in the auditorium this morning or are you in simulcast? Where'd Tim go? He's not going to admit where he is. Okay. Well, wherever you are, I know he was here for class, and it was a marvelous class about love, and I was going to ask him, so how do you feel after teaching a class? Now, it can be a good class, it can be meaningful, it can go well, but we're typically tired afterwards, right? Some sort of energy has been spent. Don't read this verse too fast. Jesus has been traveling, he's been teaching, he's been healing. Where does that put you physically? If you've been traveling, you've been teaching, and you've been healing, you have been giving and giving and giving. Would that lead you to any kind of fatigue? It would me. And if you have been traveling and teaching and healing, so you've been given over and over and over and over, what would you do if just as you get all that done, you finally get someplace and you see a whole bunch of people saying, "What about us?" What would your reaction be? Well, let's read his, verse 36. Seeing the people, here's all these crowds. Seeing the people, he felt compassion for them. There's a phenomenon called compassion fatigue. People like counselors, people like mentors, or people like in the medical field that deal with emergency examples or nurses. It's a phenomenon that says when you're giving compassion, when you're expressing empathy, when you're trying to get one shoulder under someone else's emotional burden, that you yourselves can run out of the ability to keep giving. It's a discussion about balance and making sure that you're also getting filled. You can't keep pouring out of the bucket if you don't ever get it refilled. In order to feel compassion, you've got to have something inside. Our reaction is a diagnostic to what's going on the inside. Jesus said that the mouth speaks out of the fullness of the heart. What is my reaction? What comes out when I see need? Jesus feels compassion for them because, he says, they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. Do you know anybody that is distressed or dispirited? It's not a bad description, I would say, of the average day in our culture. Would you agree with that? Distressed and dispirited. Distressed is an anxiety. I like the word stress that fits in that word. That's that emotional tension of just getting through. But dispirited is a lack of morale, a giving up. I don't know why I'm doing this. I can't keep doing this. It's a running on fumes. Distress will bring a sharpness in your response. A dispiritedness will bring an apathy in your response. So one will make you mad and the other you just don't care. And he says the reason why this is happening is because this group of people is like a sheep with no shepherd. They've wandered and they wandered and they wandered and they're about to give up because they can't ever seem to wander into the right place. So what's the yoke? What's the burden that Jesus says, I want to give you that'll be meaningful? Here's the last verse. Verse 37. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest. The yoke, the burden, is to love other people, to introduce them to the shepherd, to reach out with them and share who Jesus is. That when we see distressed and dispirited people, that our response is, do you know Jesus, the shepherd? In John chapter 10, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. You know what else he calls himself in John chapter 10? He says, I'm the door. As he describes a sheepfold, which sounds a lot like a gateway to heaven. No matter where we are, no matter what we have for a pillow, God is with us. Jesus is our rest. He's not only the ladder, but He is the presence of God in our lives, whether we know it or not. Jacob was just found a level spot to lay down. He didn't know that he'd walked right into God's house. Where we often might see desolation or emptiness, God is with us. We're in His very house. I don't know where you are in your diagnoses. I don't know how your level of weariness is. I don't know what your reactions are as you get in another line for a great deal on a Christmas something, or you see another altercation between people celebrating the most joyous time of year. Think about how we react on the inside and whether or not Jesus is our peace. Whether or not He's our rest. If we can encourage you this morning to know the great shepherd, the gateway and the doorway, then we invite you to come and sit on one of these front pews that we might pray for you and continue this walk together. If you'd like to meet with a shepherd and their wife in private, you can go the other side of this wall in classroom 1 and visit with them there in person. But be encouraged. God is with us. And it's going to be good. If we can help, would you come as together we stand and sing?